Hello, fellow bibliophiles, and welcome back to Blatantly Bookish, and welcome to a discussion all about Villette. So I'm here with Katie from Books and Things. I'm really excited to discuss Villette with her. Originally, the Brontë Project started out as a buddy read of Villette with Katie. We both wanted to read it in January, and I kind of incorporated it into this massive reread of the Brontës. But she's joining us for Villette and probably a few of the other books as well. We'll see. So, hi, Katie.
Hi, nice to be here and looking forward to discussing Villette.
Yeah, same here. So this was actually a reread of Villette for me. I read it for the first time when I was in college. That was quite a number of years ago, though. And I remember really enjoying the book. But yes, this was a reread for you as well, right, Katie?
I think this is my third read. So I studied it at university, and I think I read it twice then, like in a row or within a year of each other. But then I don't think I had read it since then. So that was about like 6-7 years ago. So it has been quite a while. So yeah, it was a bit of a different reading experience this time.
Yeah, I had the same thing. I think it was 7-8 years ago at least, maybe more. Yeah. Anyway, I didn't actually enjoy reading it as much, and I'm starting to wonder if my love for this book comes from discussing it rather than actually reading it.
Yeah, I didn't enjoy it this time as much as I had previously. I think the first and second time I read Villette, I was really impressed and I really, really enjoyed it. And I told myself that I loved it more than Jane Eyre. But reading Villette this time, I definitely didn't feel that I loved it more than Jane Eyre. I still enjoyed it and I still really liked it. And especially the second half, I think there were some wonderful moments, but I didn't love it quite as much. Which is interesting because I was expecting to love it more. And I think maybe it is because I was studying it the first times I read it and because it is such an interesting book to discuss and to study. And also I listened to it on audiobook this time, which I usually love rereading things on audiobook, but actually especially because there are some bits in French in it. It was actually a slightly trickier reading experience on audiobook than it is usually when you're reading it written down.
Yeah, that makes sense. I didn't even think about that, reading it on audiobook with all of the French. A lot of people in the Goodreads group had some trouble with the French as well, and I did too. In the beginning, I kept, looking back to the index and seeing what each of the French words meant and, what was going on. But after a while, that just kept taking me out of the reading experience, and I ended up just kind of skipping over the French. And I think to some extent that works because, you fill in with context what's going on. But to some extent, it just is distracting reading experience wise.
Yeah, I know what you mean. I think it does make it more complicated. And listening to it on audiobook, most of the French bits I just kind of ignore, but there were one or two bits where I was like, it's definitely important that I know what people are saying here, or I was looking it up. I did French at school, so I know there were some bits where I had a vague idea of what they were saying, but a lot of it I was like, I just don't really know what this conversation means now.
Yeah, exactly. Why do you think that there is so much French in here? I mean, it does take place in a foreign country. It's not mostly set in Britain like a lot of Victorian books that we read. But yeah, the abundance of French was definitely a presence in this book.
Yeah, and I think there's a certain degree to which more people in the Victorian period, at least of the class of people who would be reading this book, would have spoken French and understood those things. And obviously Charlotte Brontë knew lots of French, and there's a bit of French in Shirley as well. And I think there probably is some in Jane Eyre too, but I think it does make it slightly hard to understand. But on the other hand, I suppose you're following a main character who is slightly out of her depth in a country that isn't her own, and maybe that it's important actually that there are some bits where you don't really understand, but you're also, that puts you in the same kind of position as Lucy because she is in a country where she doesn't understand everything that's going on. Where not everyone speaks her language and she's kind of out of her depth as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And there is definitely some French in Jane Eyre, but for some reason I don't find it as jarring. I think that French in Jane Eyre is a lot more centered around the French character of Adele, and it's not that important to fully understand it. Whereas in this book, so much takes place in French. Still, I think you're right that contributes to the reading experience and to your understanding of Lucy being just completely out of her depth in a foreign country. And she does catch on eventually, and she does become quite fluent in French towards the end, of course, but it definitely contributes to that understanding of her as a character.
Yeah, I think so.
I think the use of French is also really interesting when you think of the title of the book, Villette, because I think all of Charlotte Bronte's other books are all names of people. Even the professor, which isn't a proper name, does refer to a person, whereas this book refers to a place.
Yeah, and I guess it kind of suggests that the focus is more on the place than the person. And it is a book about Lucy Snow, but she also does try and take a back seat, like all the bits at the beginning of the book when we're seeing through her eyes, but it's really about the other characters. And through quite a lot of the book, there's things she doesn't tell us. She's kind of in the background of the plot to a certain extent. So I guess maybe that's why sort of like the book isn't named after her, but it's named after the place she is instead, because it's not solely about her. And she kind of wants to deflect the attention, I guess, in a way.
Yeah, I feel like the title is just another way of Lucy being an unreliable narrator, telling us that this book is more or less all about Villette, the town, but really the book is about Lucy and all of the people that Lucy interacts with in Villette, rather than Villette itself. I feel like it could be titled Lucy Snow, except she doesn't want it to be. Instead, she titles it Villette, and it's just seriously another one of those deceptive measures of hers when telling her own story, that she takes a back seat in her own story in so many ways.
Yeah, exactly.
So yeah, let's talk about Lucy then. What did you think of her as a character?
She's such an interesting character because I don't always find her likable. And I think especially she's quite judgmental of other people, especially Ginevra Fanshawe. But all the people around her, she does kind of judge them and dismiss them. Which I find quite interesting and sometimes makes her a bit dislikable. She is an unreliable narrator. You know, I think it's quite frustrating as a reader when you get to the bit where Dr. John is revealed to be Graham Bretton, and Lucy's like, I knew all along, but I didn't want to tell you yet. I think that's quite fun in a way, but it also makes her a slightly odd narrator and a slightly unlikable character in a way. But I also do feel for her a lot. I think her loneliness, her isolation, like the kind of mental health problems she has when she's on her own in the summer when everyone is away from the school, I think is really powerful, and you do feel for her. I think, you know, the way she feels about Dr. John and later Paul is really like engaging and interesting, and there's something about the way she feels she doesn't belong in the world of Dr. John, but she might belong in the world of Monsieur Paul, which I find like really emotive later on. So I feel like she's quite an interesting character, and there are times when I like her and there are times when I slightly struggle with her as well.
Yeah, for the most part, I just struggle with her as a character. I don't really like her, but I like thinking about her, and I like thinking about why she is this way and why she has all of this deception and why she misleads the reader, why she focuses on the other characters more than herself. And I do think that a big part of it is her loneliness, her isolation, her struggle with depression, because frankly, that's what I read this as, is her struggling with, you know, clinical depression. And she just finds it so hard to connect with other people, that when she does actually connect with, you know, John and Monsieur Paul, it's really interesting how those two relationships come about. It's also interesting how she distances herself from Ginevra, and yet they're kind of friends. I think Ginevra would consider her a friend, at least.
I suppose as well, there's this interesting thing that we don't know what Lucy's childhood was like, and we know that there was some great tragedy. There's this big metaphor about a storm, and the impression is that when she's staying with Mrs. Bretton as a child, she has a family that she's going to go back to who are alive and well, and that by the time she is kind of 18, 19, 20, I can't remember her age, when she's living with Miss Marchmont as a companion, all of her family is dead, and we don't know why. So I feel like one of the really interesting things about Villette is the kind of holes in the narrative, and one of the big holes in the narrative is that we just have no idea what happened to Lucy's family, but assumedly something terribly tragic happened that meant she went from having a reasonable life and family and, you know, a support system, somewhere to live, to having none of that really suddenly. And that's quite interesting to think about, like what would have happened there, and what it is in Lucy's past that makes her the way she is and makes her as unhappy as she is as well.
And we really don't get much about Lucy's past. It seems that her parents died in the storm, but that's also incredibly metaphoric, and the storm metaphor continues on throughout the book, which I'd like to talk about later. But I think that this lack of knowledge about Lucy's past is really interesting. And it's kind of the way Lucy reacts towards everything. She just barrels forward and she doesn't look to the past for information or for guidance on her future. She always is looking at the present and trying to examine the characters around her in order to try and fit in and to move forwards. There's this very big emphasis on reading faces and reading people. And I think part of that is the reader trying to read Lucy and trying to understand Lucy, but also Lucy trying to grasp and understand all of these people around her.
Yeah, there's something quite like practical and rational about Lucy. In that she is trying to make sensible steps for her career, keep herself afloat. Like when her wealthier friends like Paulina are asking her, why are you teaching? Well, she says, well, for the money, it's important. And she is quite kind of practical and rational. But at the same time, like the steps she takes at the beginning of the book to go abroad to try and teach and to leave a country that she knows and go somewhere where she doesn't speak the language is quite it's interesting that she makes that decision, I think. And it does show that she sort of has that impulsive side as well, I suppose.
I think Lucy Snow comes across as very cold, but there's actually a lot going on beneath the surface that the real Lucy Snow may be a little more impulsive than we actually give her credit for.
It's interesting as well, of course, that she has the name Snow, which is a cold name, I suppose.
Yeah, and I don't think that's an accident. I think that her name definitely evokes that coldness, but also it's interesting to see where snow crops up in the book in other respects. I believe some of the nun scenes actually have snow in them, or that the nun is described as having a snowy veil. And yeah. Can you think of any other instances where snow crops up in the book?
I don't think so, apart from the kind of snowy scenes where she's with the Bretons later on in the book. But it's interesting, obviously, because the kind of motif of a storm is quite important throughout the book as well. So there's kind of quite a few different things about weather.
Yeah. Yeah. There's the storm in the beginning where her parents perish. But she's also described as a storm in so many respects. And then I think there's a section where Monsieur Paul is described as a bottled storm, which relates to Lucy as well. And then, of course, there's the ending, which is full of stormy imagery.
Yeah, and obviously the kind of storm at the end is very, very important. And the fact that probably Monsieur Paul is drowned in a storm at the end is quite significant to the plot and kind of echoes back to her losing people she loved at the beginning of the book in storms as well, whether metaphorical or real.
And it's really interesting, though, because the storm, as turbulent and upsetting as it is, and as many deaths as it causes in the book, it also is a part of Lucy.
I feel like there's a certain sense in the book that characters like Paulina and Dr. John are sunshine characters, and that's their lot in life. And then people like Lucy and Monsieur Paul are much more stormy in their characters and the way they live their life and how their lives are and how up and down their lives are. And that also that's sort of something that Lucy has kind of come to terms with and is happy with to a certain extent, that she knows that she's not going to have the smooth life that people like Dr. John and Paulina have, but that's okay. And she has made of her life what she has of it and succeeded.
Yeah. And I think that in some respects, that's why she doesn't fit in with these sunshine characters. Ginevra, I believe, is a sunshine character as well, Paulina and Dr. John, and she always feels a little out of place with them. But that's why I think she's so drawn to Monsieur Paul, because they're very similar in their emotional turbulence and their emotional depth. I don't really like John for Lucy. I don't feel like he deserves her because he is so different from her. And that's not to say that people who are different can't be together, but he's so different from her that he can't even grasp what her true emotions are. And he doesn't understand her in the same way that Monsieur Paul does. But then again, that leads me to wonder, does anyone actually understand her? Does the reader understand her? Is there a single character in this book who truly understands Lucy?
Yeah, I always find the ending really interesting because obviously it's a very different ending to something like Jane Eyre, and the ending is sort of very sad in some ways, but it's also left slightly weird and ambiguous. And certainly the first time I read Villette, I found the ending really odd. But there is something quite satisfying to the ending in that the kind of happy ending for Lucy is not necessarily a life of love and marriage, but she's got her school and someone loved her, and even if that person may now be dead, like, she can treasure that in a way. And I think it's difficult because I'm not sure that anyone does understand her because she is so complex, but I feel like Monsieur Paul gets the closest because he is the most similar to her, and because they understand each other and like each other for who they are, whereas I feel like everyone else has a different perception of Lucy and like a different way of understanding her. Like Ginevra Fanshawe views Lucy very differently to Paulina, and then Mrs. Bretton and Dr. John have very different opinions. And we know like what Madame Beck and Père Silas think is just not really her, and there's so many like different impressions of her, but I feel like Monsieur Paul gets the closest.
I agree that Monsieur Paul gets the closest. I think that Lucy's interactions with a lot of the other characters are her trying on different roles that they give her, and her trying on what they expect her to be, to varying degrees of success. And I think the scene where she's actually trying on the dress is really indicative of that kind of persona that she puts on for other people. And it is herself, but she doesn't even recognize herself when she's acting for these other people.
And I think in a way, Lucy Snowe does have lots of different versions of herself, and it's hard to know who her true self is. And like Monsieur Paul doesn't always get it right. He like teases her in the first half of the book for like being a coquette, which is just so entirely not Lucy. But I also feel like actually the reason why I think he says that to her is because he sees her with Dr. John, and he realizes that she likes Dr. John in a way that Dr. John will just never realize. And actually, therefore, he doesn't always get her quite right, but he sort of gets her feelings that are underneath that she never displays, which is quite interesting too.
Yeah, and it's interesting that Monsieur Paul actually sees how she is with Dr. John and understands what's going on, because Dr. John is so oblivious to her affections for him that it's really fascinating, because Lucy isn't traditionally a coquette. She's not very flirty at all, but that was her attempt to flirt with Dr. John, and Monsieur Paul actually sees that.
It's interesting as well that Lucy has lots of different identities, but she's always known by her name, but I feel like there's lots of other characters who have lots of different names. Like obviously Dr. John is Dr. John, but he's also Graham Bretton. Paulina and her father, Paulina used to be Polly, and her father and her have a different surname now than they used to. And Monsieur Paul is sometimes Emmanuel and sometimes Paul. And I feel like names have quite an interesting significance throughout the book.
Yeah, I never thought about other characters trying on different identities, but they really do. But I feel like a lot of the identity they're trying on is nationalistic in a sense, that they go from their British name to their French or Belgian name, especially with the case of Paulina. Her surname, I believe, was Home originally, and that, you know, she had to get rid of her home to exist in this French Belgian world. And I think if I remember correctly, they switched their name to something incredibly French sounding.
Yeah. But Paulina is quite interesting too, because she does also, like, her father still views her as a child, but she's very much grown up, and she's sort of, there are scenes where she's kind of flip-flopping between like her child self and her adult self, because she's at that kind of in-between stage as well.
That's really interesting. I never gave much thought to Paulina. I thought of her as a very kind of one-note character without much depth to her, but yeah, I do think that it's interesting the way her childhood and her adulthood kind of blend together in interesting ways. And I think her relationship with Graham, John, is interesting in that respect, because she, in the beginning of the book, it's almost like she's trying on adulthood with her interactions with him, that she's trying to take care of him the way a wife would. And then later on in the book, you see her come into that role a lot more clearly.
I think as well, there's a sort of interesting because Paulina or Polly is quite a big focus in like the first section of the book, and then obviously she comes back later. And I feel like she's a much more like conventional Victorian heroine, and her and Dr. John have a much more conventional Victorian love story. And I quite like the idea that Lucy is sort of would be a minor character in another Victorian book, but she has become the central character here. And then there's this sort of much more conventional Victorian novel going on in the background between Paulina and John. And then we have, Lucy and her sort of more interesting story in the foreground, I suppose. Because one of the things I quite like about Villette is that I feel like it's quite different from a lot of other Victorian novels. I don't find the plot terribly predictable. The first time I read it, Monsieur Paul as a like important character sort of came out of nowhere. I didn't notice him for ages, and then suddenly I was like, oh, this is exciting, which I really like about it.
Yeah, I love that idea of other novels working in the background. And I think you could actually do the same thing with Ginevra as a character and create another novel based on her and Lucy's relationship. There's definitely aspects of this book that could be made into other books, but the focus is on Lucy, and Lucy just doesn't want the spotlight. And it's really interesting to see that unfold.
Yeah, I agree. And I think Ginevra is quite an interesting character too, because there are some ways in which she is quite dislikable, but I also find there's something quite captivating about her. Like, I think she's a really interesting character, and Lucy kind of judges Ginevra and is quite hard on her and dislikes her, but there's actually something about her that I find quite interesting, quite fun to read about.
Yeah, Ginevra is just kind of a really fun character in a way that Lucy isn't, but she's also kind of vapid, and I think that there's a lot more depth to her than the book gives her credit for, and she could be a really interesting main character in a different novel.
Yeah, absolutely.
So it was really interesting also the way you said that it was an unpredictable book. I definitely think it was. But something I really liked about the ending was all of the different things that I read into the ending. I have all these crazy interpretations of the ending and the storm as a storm of depression rather than, a real storm. Is the storm that Monsieur Paul experiences something more psychological and something that he ends up succumbing to, maybe not bodily, but emotionally. And I think that that's an interesting interpretation because storms are so linked with Lucy's feelings and emotions and sense of loneliness throughout the book as well. So I definitely think there's some sort of a reading where you feel that Monsieur Paul survived bodily, but never truly returned to Lucy emotionally.
I think that's the interesting thing about the ending is that it is very ambiguous. And what we're told is that the 3 years that Monsieur Paul is away are the happiest of Lucy's life, and they write letters to each other, and she enjoys it, and she has her school. And then we know that there's a storm and he's on the way home, and that's all. And I suppose the one interpretation is that he is dead and that he drowns on his way home in a shipwreck. Another interpretation is that he comes home and something else goes wrong, or that like he comes home, but actually they don't have a happy ending. They don't have a happy marriage. And I think there's lots of different interpretations there, and lots of different possibilities. And I think there's also a certain extent to which, like, would Lucy carry on her school that she runs as a married woman? How would that change her at the school? Are the 3 years he's away the happiest because she can both run her school and have a relationship with him? And maybe she can't do both if he does get home. Like, I feel like there's so many different possibilities in that ending. It's just, it's very, very interesting as an ending. And I quite like it for that, even though I feel like it's really weird as well.
Yeah, it's very weird, but I love the ambiguity and I love reading things into it. So reading things like what you were saying, that perhaps he does return home, but that's the end of their happy love affair, that those 3 years where they were anticipating what would happen when he did return were actually much happier than when he returned. Or you could look at it as that was the culmination of their love affair. Even though they were long distance, they were the most emotionally connected through their letters. And that anticipation of him coming home was what was so exciting. But then, of course, he passed away in the storm, and that was all it came to, those 3 years of anticipation and love. And those were actually more fulfilling than anything she could have imagined or hoped for, perhaps.
Yeah, and I think even if the way to read the ending is that he does die, it's like almost like Charlotte Brontë needs to kill Monsieur Paul off because she doesn't think they could actually have the right life together, which I find quite interesting. I think as well, for a lot of people who find the ending of Jane Eyre a bit disappointing because they don't think Mr. Rochester's good enough for Jane, I feel like Villette's a very interesting book to read if that's your feeling, because it has such a different ending.
I was just going to say, most people think Jane Eyre has a really happy ending, but some people read into that happy ending that, Mr. Rochester's not good enough for Jane, that the relationship is incredibly problematic. And I think this does the exact opposite. It takes something that seems like a very sad ending and makes you wonder, well, actually, is this the best possible outcome for our heroine?
Yeah, and we know she has her school and we assume it's going to be successful in some way. We don't know very much about Lucy's future life, but there's one point early on in the book where she says something like, I'm talking over time, a long time ago now, my hair's white. So she's obviously like an elderly woman when she's telling the story. There's like one little clue to that, which means she must have lived a fairly long life. And I suppose, yeah, we don't really know what happens to her after the end of the book, but I feel like she would carry on with her school and maybe she'd make a success of it and carry on living there and being happy there. I don't know.
That's what I like to think happens, at least. So yeah, the ending is one way in which Villette is such a different and unique book. But I think another way, besides Lucy as the narrator and the ending, I think another way that it's really interesting is the way that it combines both the supernatural and the Gothic elements and realism in a way that I think Jane Eyre does that pretty successfully as well. But this book does too. And I think that's what makes Charlotte a really interesting writer, that she's able to do that. And her range of novel writing is just so varied. None of her novels are very predictable, conventional novels.
Yeah, exactly. And I feel like the kind of Gothic stuff in Villette is really interesting. We obviously have the figure of the nun, but then there's also bits like the scene where Madame Beck has like put something in Lucy's drink and then Lucy goes out to this big carnival and she's sort of high, which is really, really weird. Like there's some very odd, slightly supernaturally, I don't know, just got this like dreamlike quality to them in Villette, which I find really interesting. And all the kind of ambiguity of the bits that we don't know about Lucy's life feel quite Gothic as well. That kind of not quite knowing what's going on, I suppose.
And I love the scene where she buries the letters. All the scenes where she sees the nun are incredibly Gothic. And there's also something quite Gothic about Madame Beck as a character in general, and the way she constantly surveils Lucy. There's something very Gothic about that. It's almost as if Madame Beck is the quintessential Gothic patriarch in a sense, monitoring Lucy's every move.
Yeah, I think there's definitely something a bit creepy and Gothic about Madame Beck.
Yeah, she's one of my favorite characters, but she's also like a role model for Lucy in so many respects, because Lucy, what she does in essence with her life is becomes Madame Beck. She starts running her own school. And I think to some extent she uses Madame Beck as a, guideline for doing that.
Yeah, and I think like it's interesting that Lucy seems to respect Madame Beck more than you think she should. Like I kind of think it's terrible that Madame Beck just like roots through Lucy's things all the time, and Lucy's like, oh, she's just trying to find out a way to understand me. I feel like Lucy sort of gets the behavior of Madame Beck even when she thinks it isn't right, which is quite interesting too. It sort of takes that Gothicness about her and turns it on its head a little bit.
I think in a lot of ways, Madame Beck encourages Lucy's deception and Lucy's coldness, the way she keeps things from other people, because she is constantly under surveillance by Madame Beck, but I think in a lot of ways she's also just constantly under surveillance from other characters. And the way Madame Beck treats her makes her realize that Madame Beck is not the only one surveying her, that everyone is surveying her.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's very true. And I think as well, there's a certain I think in a way, Charlotte Brontë is like turning Gothic stuff on its head. So we have Madame Beck, who is a bit sinister, but also she's sinister just because she's keeping an eye on her employees. And Monsieur Paul like goes through Lucy's desk, but he does it to like leave her books inside her desk that he thinks she'll like. And we have the nun, which obviously is then proved to not actually be a ghost of any kind. It's just Ginevra Fanshaw's suitor sneaking in late at night. So there's lots of like interesting stuff where we have things set up to be kind of creepy that are then sort of undercut later on in the book.
Yeah, and I think that's actually really interesting when you think about sort of more domestic Gothic and, you know, how Gothic tropes are used in a lot of other books and certainly in Jane Eyre, where things are Gothic, but then there's also a really rational explanation for them. And the Gothicness in some senses is all in the character's head.
Yeah, I think so. And actually that kind of is quite interesting because Lucy Snow is a character who thinks a lot, who has a very big internal life, who struggles with loneliness and depression, I would say. And so the fact that the kind of she sees someone dressed up as a nun and her first thought is a haunting, or that she's kind of, you know, losing her mind, and actually there is this rational explanation as she finds out in the end.
Yeah, I think a lot about the nun scenes reflect more on Lucy than on what's actually going on.
Yeah, and there's that interesting bit as well where they see the nun, Lucy and Monsieur Poor all together, and he thinks it's the nun too. He thinks it's the ghost of the woman he used to love, because he's also reading stuff into it about his own kind of conflicted emotions and how he worries about, you know, whether or not he's been true enough to Justine Marie, I think she's called. So there's all kind of that interesting stuff going on as well.
Yeah, and that also goes to show just how similar Monsieur Paul and Lucy are, in that they both invent different interpretations of what this nun represents and is, when in reality there's just a rational explanation that they both completely disregard or don't even try to think about.
Yeah, exactly. And also, I guess the fact it is a figure of a nun, like there's a lot in this about kind of Protestantism and Catholicism and how different they are, and how Lucy feels quite like she feels her religion is sort of comes into doubt a bit more because she's living in a country that's predominantly Catholic, having come from one that's predominantly Protestant. And so the fact that she thinks she's being haunted by a nun, and she also kind of says multiple times in the book that she is sort of interested in Catholicism, and that she thinks if she were pushed a little bit, she could convert to Catholicism. So I think there's sort of that interesting element as well, that the ghostly figure at the heart of the book is a nun.
Yeah, and I think it's really interesting that you have this person dressed up as someone else, this idea of taking on other people's identities, other people's roles, other people's religions, perhaps even, or nationalities, and other people's identities in this book, that people have multiple identities and multiple faces that they show other people, and they can choose to withhold some aspects of themselves from others in this way.
Yeah, I feel like there's so much in Villette about identity and lots of different sides of people's identity that's really, really interesting.
Yeah, and I think that's what I love most about this book is, you know, just thinking about it and talking about it and discussing all the different facets of everyone's identities and all the different ambiguities that the book, you know, has in it, all the different plot holes and such. So yeah, I don't love reading Villette that much, but I certainly love discussing it. But I think for me, I personally like Jane Eyre better. What about you?
Yeah, I think I do too. I think I have thought for ages that I liked Villette more, but returning to Villette, it's really interesting. And I think in a way it's a more interesting novel than Jane Eyre. Like, it's a fascinating book, but I don't think I get the same enjoyment out of it as I do of Jane Eyre. And I don't think I get quite the same satisfaction as Jane Eyre. But then I haven't reread Jane Eyre for a couple of years, but I'll reread it later in the year for whatever month it is in your Brontë Project. So maybe I'll make up my mind properly then.
Yeah, I mean, I think Villette is the better novel when you're looking at it from a literary standpoint and you want to analyze it and you want to break it down and you want to, you know, discuss Charlotte's ability as a writer. But Jane Eyre just has something that appeals to generations. And, you know, if you talk about the Brontes with the average person, maybe they'll be able to throw out the title of Jane Eyre and Wuthering Heights. And that speaks volumes, I think, that Jane Eyre has just, you know, captivated us so much. And this book doesn't captivate me in the same way that Jane Eyre does. It just doesn't.
I think it's partly because it's so hard to get to know Lucy, whereas like when you read Jane Eyre, you feel like you know Jane completely and you completely engaged with her as a character, and you completely understand her, whereas I feel like Lucy is still a bit of an unknowable quantity, which is kind of fun, but also means that I feel like one step away from the book in a way that I just never feel with Jane Eyre.
Yeah, there's such an immediacy to Jane as a character that you definitely don't get in this book. And I think that Jane in some respects, doesn't show herself to the people around her, but she reveals herself completely to the reader, whereas Lucy does the opposite. Lucy shows tons of different sides of herself to various characters depending on who they are, and she tries to connect with them, but she withholds herself from the reader. And I think that's to the detriment of the enjoyment of the reader. But you know, it's not to the detriment of the book. It's a really interesting, fascinating book, but I don't think I'd recommend it for, you know, your first Brontë novel. So perhaps it was not the best one to start with for the Brontë Project, but I know you and I both wanted to reread it, and we wanted to read it in January, and then I kind of created the whole Brontë Project around that. So that's why it was the first one. Yeah, it's an interesting book.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to rereading the other Brontes this year as well. It's been ages since I read The Professor, and that has some stuff in common with Villette, so that'll be really interesting. I'm really looking forward to rereading Jane Eyre. It's such an amazing novel. So yeah, it'll be interesting to read a few more other Brontë books this year and kind of compare.
Yeah, I'm really interested in getting to the rest of the Brontë books. I'm particularly excited for the Anne books. Anne Brontë, I mean, I've only read both of her books once, and I have fond memories of them, but I want to revisit them and see how they compare to some of the books that I'm so familiar with, because I've read Jane Eyre and Wuthering Heights plenty of times at this point. But those books, I think if I read them more often, they would be favorites of mine, you know, on the level of Jane Eyre and Wuthering Heights. Villette, I feel like no matter how many times I reread it, will not be that special for me. Yeah, so I don't know if you'll join us for the rest of our Brontë discussions, but I'm sure you'll join us for a few more. And I'm excited for the rest of the Brontë Project. I'd love to hear your thoughts, not you, Katie, but all of our viewers, their thoughts in the comment section down below. What did you think of Villette? What books are you most excited to get to this year for the Brontë Project? Do you find Villette to be more enjoyable than Jane Eyre, less enjoyable, a better book? Yeah, I'm just so excited to hear all that you guys have to say about Villette and anything we discussed in the comment section. So thank you, Katie, for joining us. And until next time, I look forward to seeing you in another video very soon. Bye.